The Bay of Pigs invasion. In the pre-dawn darkness of April 17, 1961, a small force of just over 1,400 Cuban exiles waded ashore on a swampy stretch of Cuba's southern coastline, trained, armed, and transported by the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States, believing they were about to spark a popular uprising that would topple Fidel Castro's young revolutionary government. Within 72 hours, the invasion had collapsed entirely. Hundreds of the exiles were dead, and nearly 1,200 more were prisoners of the very government they had come to overthrow. This is the story of the Bay of Pigs invasion, one of the most consequential failures in the history of American foreign policy. The men who planned it, the men who fought and died in it, and the young president whose decisions in its final hours would shape the rest of his presidency. To understand how the United States government came to sponsor an armed invasion of Cuba, you have to go back to January 1959, when Fidel Castro, a young revolutionary lawyer, led a guerrilla movement that successfully overthrew the corrupt and authoritarian government of Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista, a longtime ally of the United States whose regime had grown deeply unpopular both within Cuba and increasingly abroad due to its corruption and brutality. Castro's revolution was initially greeted with considerable sympathy and even enthusiasm in parts of the United States. But relations between the new Cuban government and Washington deteriorated with striking speed over the following 2 years as Castro's government nationalized American-owned businesses and properties on the island without what the United States considered adequate compensation, moved increasingly toward alignment with the Soviet Union in the broader context of the Cold War, and began a program of executions and imprisonments targeting officials and supporters of the deposed Batista regime, developments that transformed Castro in the eyes of the American government and much of the Cuban exile community that fled the island in these same years, from a promising democratic reformer into an increasingly alarming communist threat sitting just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. By March 1960, President Dwight D. Eisenhower had authorized the Central Intelligence Agency to begin developing a plan for the covert removal of Castro's government, initially envisioning a program focused on supporting internal Cuban resistance and paramilitary sabotage operations rather than a direct, large-scale military invasion. The CIA operation was placed under the direction of Richard Bissell, the agency's deputy director for plans, working under the overall authority of CIA Director Allen Dulles, and the plan evolved considerably over the following year as CIA planners, drawing in part on the agency's earlier experience successfully orchestrating the 1954 overthrow of the government of Guatemala, gradually shifted toward a more ambitious concept involving the training of a substantial paramilitary force of Cuban exiles, who would be transported back to the island in an amphibious landing intended to establish a beachhead and, according to the plan's underlying assumptions, spark a broader popular uprising against Castro's government that the initial exile force alone could never hope to achieve through military means. The exile force at the heart of this plan eventually organized and designated Brigade 2506, a number chosen in honor of a young trainee who had died during training and whose military identification number was 2506, was recruited primarily from among the tens of thousands of Cubans who had fled the island since Castro's rise to power, drawn from a wide range of backgrounds, including former Batista-era military officers, businessmen who had lost property to Castro's nationalization programs, students, and ordinary citizens opposed to the direction Castro's government had taken, united by their shared determination to see Castro's government overthrown, whatever their sometimes considerably different visions for what should replace it. The brigade even included a small number of Catholic priests who served as chaplains alongside the fighting men, and its ranks spanned an unusually wide age range, from teenagers barely out of secondary school to men in their 40s who had left established careers and families behind in the hope of returning to a free Cuba, a genuinely diverse cross-section of Cuban exile society bound together primarily by shared opposition to Castro rather than any single unifying political ideology of their own. The brigade's military commander was José Pérez San Román, known to his men as Pepe San Román, a former Cuban Army officer who had been trained, along with the rest of the brigade, at secret CYMA-operated camps established primarily in Guatemala, with additional training conducted at a base in the United States itself under the supervision of American CIA paramilitary instructors who worked to prepare the exile force for the amphibious landing and subsequent combat operations that lay ahead. Training for the brigade took place primarily at a secluded camp in the mountains of Guatemala known as Base Tracks, established with the cooperation of the Guatemalan government under President Miguel Ydígoras Fuentes, where recruits endured months of physically demanding instruction in infantry tactics, parachute training, and amphibious landing procedures under the direction of American CIA paramilitary officers operating under assumed identities. Conditions at the camp were reportedly harsh, and morale among the trainees fluctuated considerably over the many months of preparation, complicated further by the fact that the operation's existence became something of an open secret well before the actual invasion, with American newspapers, including a detailed report published by the Miami News in January 1961, and eventually the New York Times itself, publishing accounts of Cuban exiles training for an anticipated invasion, developments that undermined the very secrecy upon which the operation's chances of surprise, and by extension success, had originally depended. The plan inherited a new and, in some crucial respects, more cautious overseer when John F. Kennedy assumed the presidency in January 1961, having been briefed on the developing invasion plan during the transition period following his election victory the previous November. Kennedy, weighing the considerable political risks of what would become an unusually large and difficult-to-conceal covert operation against the potential benefits of removing a communist government from the Western Hemisphere so early in his new administration, ultimately approved a modified version of the invasion plan, but with several significant changes from the CIA's original conception, most consequentially insisting on a landing site less likely to be immediately and visibly attributable to direct American military involvement, and progressively scaling back the scope of American air support that CIA planners had originally envisioned providing to the operation, changes driven substantially by Kennedy's determination to maintain what came to be called plausible deniability regarding direct American government involvement in the operation, a political consideration that would prove to have devastating and largely unanticipated military consequences once the invasion actually began. The landing site ultimately selected was the Bay of Pigs, known in Spanish as Bahia de Cochinos, a remote swampy inlet along Cuba's southern coast in the province of Las Villas, chosen in part for its relative isolation from major population centers and Cuban military garrisons, a consideration intended to give the landing force time to establish and defend its beachhead before Cuban government forces could mobilize an effective response, though this same isolation, as events would soon demonstrate, also meant the surrounding terrain offered the invading force few good options for retreat or dispersal into the countryside if the initial landing did not go according to plan, a critical vulnerability in the operation's underlying design that would prove catastrophically significant once fighting began. In the days immediately preceding the main landing, the CIA operation included a preliminary air component intended to destroy Castro's small air force on the ground, reducing the risk that Cuban government aircraft could interfere with the amphibious landing or the ships transporting the invasion force. On April 15, 1961, a small group of CIA-supplied B-26 bomber aircraft, painted with false Cuban Air Force markings in an attempt to disguise American involvement and create the impression that the strikes had been carried out by defecting Cuban pilots, attacked several Cuban airfields, but the strikes succeeded in destroying only a portion of Castro's available aircraft, leaving a small but, as it would soon prove, militarily significant number of Cuban government planes still operational and ready to respond when the main invasion began just 2 days later. The disguised airstrikes of April 15th placed the Kennedy administration in a particularly awkward diplomatic position at the United Nations, where American Ambassador Adlai Stevenson, who had not been fully briefed on the covert nature of the operation and the cover story being employed, publicly and forcefully denied before the UN General Assembly that the United States government had any involvement in the strikes, presenting the false Cuban Air Force markings on the attacking planes as genuine evidence that Cuban defectors, not American-backed forces, were responsible, a denial that Stevenson made in good faith based on the information he had been given. But that left him personally embarrassed and professionally undermined once the full truth of American involvement became undeniable in the days that followed, a diplomatic complication that weighed directly on Kennedy's subsequent decision to scale back further air operations. This partial failure of the preliminary airstrikes proved deeply consequential when President Kennedy, facing mounting international scrutiny and suspicion regarding American involvement following the April 15th strikes, including pointed public questioning at the United Nations, where the American ambassador, working from information provided by the CIA cover story, had denied any American government role in the attacks, made the fateful decision to cancel a second, more extensive round of planned airstrikes that had been scheduled to further degrade Cuban air defenses immediately before the main amphibious landing began. A decision driven primarily by Kennedy's determination to further limit the appearance of direct American military involvement, but one that CIA and military planners had explicitly and repeatedly warned would leave the invading force dangerously exposed to the surviving Cuban aircraft that the initial strikes had failed to destroy. The main invasion force began landing at the Bay of Pigs in the early morning hours of April 17, 1961, with Brigade 2506 coming ashore at two primary locations, Playa Girón and Playa Larga, transported by a small fleet of CIA chartered ships. The landing encountered immediate and unexpected complications, including treacherous coral reefs offshore that had not been adequately identified in pre-invasion planning and reconnaissance, damaging several of the invasion force's landing craft and slowing the already difficult process of getting troops and, crucially, heavy equipment and ammunition ashore in the critical early hours of the operation when speed and surprise offered the invaders their best hope of success. Castro's government, which had received considerable advance warning of the impending invasion through various intelligence channels, including extensive prior press coverage of the exile training camps in Guatemala that had made the operation something considerably less than the secret CIA planners had originally intended it to be, responded with remarkable speed once the landing began, personally taking direct command of Cuban military forces responding to the invasion and rapidly mobilizing troops, tanks, and, most critically, the surviving aircraft from the incomplete April 15th airstrikes toward the invasion site. Castro himself reportedly traveled to the front near Playa Girón to observe and direct the counterattack in person, at one point personally commanding an artillery battery and later riding in a tank as Cuban forces pressed their assault on the exile positions, a level of direct, hands-on battlefield involvement by a head of government that struck many observers, both at the time and since, as remarkable, and that contributed significantly to the speed and coordination of the Cuban military response. These Cuban aircraft, though limited in number, proved devastatingly effective against the invasion force's vulnerable supply ships still working to unload troops, ammunition, and equipment offshore, sinking or forcing the withdrawal of several critical vessels, including ships carrying reserve ammunition and communications equipment that the brigade would desperately need in the days of fighting that followed, a naval and logistical disaster that Kennedy's cancellation of the additional planned airstrikes had left the invasion force with essentially no effective means of preventing. As fighting intensified over the following 2 days, Brigade 2506, despite fighting with considerable tenacity and inflicting significant casualties on the Cuban government forces converging on their beachhead, found itself increasingly outnumbered, outgunned, and, crucially, cut off from the resupply of ammunition and reinforcements that the operation's underlying plan had assumed would be necessary to sustain the beachhead until the hoped-for popular uprising against Castro materialized, an uprising that, in the event, never occurred, as the Cuban population, whatever reservations some segments may genuinely have held about Castro's government, did not rise up in the manner CIA planners had confidently predicted, leaving the Exile Brigade fighting essentially alone against the full weight of Cuban government military forces. Brigade Commander Pepe San Roman, along with his fellow commanders on the ground, made repeated and increasingly desperate appeals for American air support and additional supplies as the military situation deteriorated over April 18th and into the early morning hours of April 19th, appeals that reached the highest levels of the Kennedy administration during a series of tense, late-night meetings at the White House, during which senior military and CIA officials pressed the president to authorize direct American air cover to save the collapsing operation, a request Kennedy ultimately declined, unwilling to escalate direct American military involvement in a manner that risked transforming a covert operation already compromised as a secret in any meaningful sense into an unambiguous and internationally provocative act of American military aggression against Cuba, a decision that effectively sealed the fate of the men still fighting on the beaches below. By April 19, 1961, with ammunition exhausted, no prospect of the promised American air support materializing and Cuban government forces closing in from multiple directions, Brigade 2506's position collapsed entirely. San Roman transmitted a final anguished radio message to the American naval vessels standing offshore, reporting that he had no ammunition remaining, was destroying his equipment and communications gear, and did not wish to be evacuated, choosing instead to remain with the men still under his command as organized resistance came to an end. In the chaotic hours that followed, some exile fighters managed to escape into the surrounding swampland, where many were subsequently hunted down and captured by Cuban forces over the following days, while approximately 1,189 members of the brigade were ultimately taken prisoner, and an estimated 114 brigade members were killed during the 3 days of fighting. The captured members of Brigade 2506 were held in Cuban custody for the following 20 months, during which Castro's government conducted a series of well-publicized show trials and ultimately negotiated their release in December 1962 in exchange for a substantial shipment of food and medical supplies from the United States, valued at approximately $53 million, an arrangement negotiated in a significant part through the efforts of American attorney James Donovan, working with the tacit approval and support of the Kennedy administration, bringing the surviving prisoners home to the United States roughly a year and a half after their capture, where they were greeted notably by President Kennedy himself at a ceremony in Miami in December 1962, during which Kennedy accepted the brigade's flag and offered a symbolic pledge that it would one day be returned and flown in a free Havana, a promise that, more than 6 decades later, has never been fulfilled. The failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion proved deeply and immediately consequential for the Kennedy administration, representing a significant early foreign policy embarrassment that damaged American credibility and standing on the world stage while simultaneously strengthening Castro's domestic political position within Cuba considerably, as the failed American-backed invasion allowed him to portray his government as having successfully defended Cuban sovereignty against direct imperialist aggression from the United States, a narrative that proved politically valuable to Castro's government for years afterward. Kennedy himself, in the invasion's immediate aftermath, publicly accepted personal responsibility for the operation's failure, a decision that, somewhat paradoxically, actually resulted in a temporary boost to his domestic approval ratings, even as internal administration reviews, most notably an investigation led by retired General Maxwell Taylor, identified a wide range of planning, intelligence, and decision-making failures spanning the CIA, the military, and the White House itself that had collectively contributed to the operation's collapse. In the institutional aftermath of the failure, both CIA Director Allen Dulles and Deputy Director Richard Bissell, the two officials most directly responsible for planning and overseeing the operation, ultimately departed the agency within roughly a year of the invasion, their resignations widely understood as a direct consequence of the operation's catastrophic failure, even as Kennedy, in public statements at the time, took pains to avoid appearing to scapegoat individual officials for what he acknowledged were failures spanning the entire chain of decision-making, his own included. The episode also prompted Kennedy to place considerably greater personal scrutiny on subsequent CIA covert operations and military recommendations, a shift in approach that many historians believe directly informed his more cautious and deliberative decision-making style during the far more dangerous Cuban Missile Crisis that would follow just 18 months later. Among the most significant and lasting consequences of the failed invasion was its substantial contribution to deepening Cold War tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union over Cuba specifically, as Castro, having survived what he correctly understood as a direct American attempt to overthrow his government, moved to further strengthen Cuba's military and political ties with the Soviet Union, requesting and eventually receiving increased Soviet military assistance that would, within roughly 18 months of the failed invasion, culminate in the secret deployment of Soviet nuclear missiles to Cuban territory, triggering the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962, widely regarded as the most dangerous direct confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union of the entire Cold War era, a crisis whose origins can be traced in meaningful part back to the failed invasion at the Bay of Pigs and its role in convincing both Castro and his Soviet patrons that a more robust and visible Soviet military commitment to Cuba's defense had become an urgent strategic necessity. The Bay of Pigs invasion has remained, in the decades since, a frequently studied case history in the fields of American foreign policy, intelligence analysis, and organizational decision-making, cited repeatedly as a cautionary example of how flawed assumptions, inadequate contingency planning, excessive institutional confidence in the accuracy of prior intelligence assessments, and a fundamental disconnect between the ambitions of a covert operation and the political constraints placed upon it by policymakers unwilling to fully commit to its success, can combine to produce catastrophic failure, even when substantial resources, extensive planning, and considerable operational secrecy are brought to bear on an undertaking, a lesson that later generations of American policymakers, with decidedly mixed success, have continued to study and attempt to apply to their own subsequent foreign policy and military decision-making in the decades that have followed. The Bay of Pigs invasion lasted only 3 days, but its consequences echoed for decades. It reshaped American foreign policy, strengthened Fidel Castro's rule, pushed Cuba even closer to the Soviet Union, and helped set the stage for the Cuban Missile Crisis, the closest the world has ever come to nuclear war. History is often remembered through its greatest victories, but sometimes its greatest lessons come from its failures. The Bay of Pigs remains a reminder that even the most carefully planned operations can collapse when assumptions replace reality and when politics and strategy pull in different directions. Thank you for watching this episode of the Retro Review. We know there are many documentaries covering history's greatest moments, but our goal is to explore these stories in a way that sparks curiosity and conversation. If you stayed with us until the very end, we truly appreciate your time and support. If you enjoyed this documentary, please leave a like, share it with someone who loves history, and subscribe to the Retro Review. Don't forget to turn on the bell icon so you never miss another story that changed the world. Until next time, keep exploring the past, because history isn't just about what happened. It's about understanding how those moments continue to shape the world we live in today.